Hello there, this is the third of these YouTube tutorials. Hopefully by now you've been thinking about the focus of your own institution-based project. But what we thought might be a good idea was for you to listen to how another student previously has unpicked their study and filled in that particular research plan that we've asked you to consider. Now, before I explain and read through how they've constructed that, just to reassure you, I've got to stress that this is a very particular context that's relevant to this particular student's job and role. Yours will be very, very different, okay? It might be that you focused on something very small and very structured and very precise, or maybe something much wider. So again, don't be intimidated by this, because each of you will have a very unique insight into this project, and of course we will help you with that. But nonetheless, it's quite good to see how somebody else has constructed their research plan. Now, in terms of space, this probably runs over 2.5 sides of A4, so that's roughly the amount of effort and input we would be expecting you to put in. But again, some will have more, some will have less, because again, this is an individual project. If we start then, and I start to read through, I mean, it might be a good idea for you to actually have a look at the research plan, have a look at the boxes on it, so that you can read through what I'm filling in that particular structure. Anyway, if we look at the title that this particular student chose, the title is Developing Awareness of Speech, Language and Communication Needs through Whole Staff Training. And Speech, Language and Communication Needs in bracket SLCN. So I'll probably say that to save my tongue in the rest of this little clip. The rationale then, what have you chosen to investigate? Why is this important to you, your school and its students? And how does this link to your practice? Well, the rationale for that from this student starts by saying, I'm interested in developing my understanding of SLCN so that I can advise and support others. Equally, it's relevant to government policy. We had the Burko report that came out in 2008 and the National Year of Communication in 2011. So this student is linking them to those policies. Equally, within our local authority, it's a key focus because we have a lot of exclusions at Key Stage 3. Equally, provision to support pupils with these needs is being developed in the school, and we want to engage with this good practice. And finally, there is some information from annual reviews that have highlighted staff development needs in this area. So again, a range of different rationale there that link to not only the staff needs, but also to the wider literature. Okay, so what's the context then? What is your role within the school? What are the unique characteristics of your school? And how has the context influenced your study or this research? Well, A, the student is a Senko in a large secondary school. There are a proportion of students with speech and language and communication difficulty, and they're relatively high numbers in comparison to local statistics. Equally, there's a high number of students for whom English is their second or even third language. Some are delayed in English by 4 or 5 years if they didn't learn English until they started school. And anecdotal evidence also reveals a lack of staff confidence and understanding in the area of SLCN. Okay, so the context then again relates to statistics, but also relates to anecdotal evidence related to staff. So, the aims of the project. What do you want to know more about? What do you want to discover? What specific improvements do you want to make? And how will you notice a difference? Okay, so the aim of this action research project is to increase the awareness of staff about the area of SLCN and the impact that SLCN can have on students' learning and overall attainment. So therefore, the objectives are to understand what SLCN difficulties are, to identify students with SLCN and how their difficulties may present in the classroom, to understand that language and communication is everyone's responsibility, and to also know some strategies to support students with SLCN in the classroom. So there you can see that student has outlined the rationale, what they want to investigate, the context, their own particular school and setting, and the aims of their research. So if you look now further down the actual research plan, you can see that there's the section that relates to literature. So again, the questions: what sources support your chosen rationale, and what comparisons can I make between what has been done before and what I am doing now? So in this section, you don't need to have the vast array of literature that you're going to use, but perhaps pinpoint some key resources and sources and commentators, perhaps about 5 or 6 or 7, just to show that you're thinking about the wider literature. So for the example I'm talking about that relates to SLCN in schools, there are things like the Burko report of 2008 that suggested that 50% of children from socio-economically disadvantaged backgrounds have impoverished language skills for their age. So that's a very sort of a good point to make. Equally, Burko suggests that 7% of children entering primary school have a significant difficulty with speech and language, and that 1% of children entering primary school have the most severe and complex SLCN. So again, I'm linking what the literature says to my own particular context. Equally, the Communication Trust in 2011 suggested there is a shift in the prevalence of SLCN between primary and secondary schools, with secondary schools having fewer identified, but a greater degree of students identified with SEBD, social emotional behavioural difficulties. So again, there is some interesting development in the literature. Equally, commentators like Archer say things like the identification of SLCN in schools is getting better, but there is limited research in this area when compared to other difficulties or disorders, for example, ADHD or dyslexia. Equally, authors like Mount Stephen in 2011 discussed that the impact of SLCN and the link with behaviour, reporting that children presenting with language difficulties at 3 years of age are likely to develop behaviour problems by the age of 8. So again, that literature suggesting an interesting correlation between SLCN and behaviour, and why we as practitioners might need to be aware of it. Equally, commentators like McKeon, 2011, discuss how teachers have an assumption that children at secondary age will have developed age-appropriate language skills. And again, we know that perhaps that assumption is not correct and has additional difficulties. And then finally, commentators like Ripley et al. 2001 saying that it's evident that children with SLCN are often perceived as being difficult or challenging. So there you can see there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different sources that say a range of different things, but again, I'm constructing the rationale around my particular topic and focus. The literature is helping me to make the case for why this is an interesting thing to look at and study. Okay, the next section then relates to methods and implementation. So here we're asking you to think about what do you want to do and how do you need to do it in terms of getting the data. Is what I'm doing actually action research? What ethical issues are there to consider? How can I avoid bias, and as I'm a participant in this particular research? And also what other potential issues might there be and how might I avoid them? So, for example, in this section, this particular student wants to audit the understanding and skills of teaching staff based within the Inclusion Development Programme. Okay, so it's a very clear audit of those professionals. Equally, they want to analyse the audit to reveal areas for development. So from that audit, different issues might sort of spring out that we need to look at. Equally, I want to lead a number of staff meeting sessions to develop understanding and skills. And then a final audit and interviews to understand the impact of this training and future strategy. And then finally, if possible, to amend this training to adapt and suit the developmental needs of the staff. And then finally, to consider training with paraprofessionals, teaching assistants, and relate this specifically to interventions. So again, quite a practical approach to this particular topic. The next point then, ethics. Obviously, this is a hot potato that has to be considered. I'm going to have to consult with the head teacher to approve the study. That's the first and most important thing. Ethical consent has to come from all of the participants, in this case teachers, and ensure this is not linked with teacher appraisal, because teachers themselves have their own audit and professional expectations. Some subject staff might consider this to be not part of their role, so therefore I've got to be very clear that this is, they participate in a voluntary way. So making all of this very clear, very transparent, and very upfront with my colleagues. In order to avoid bias, I might need to consult with an external agency about leading some of the professional development and also helping to analyse initial findings. And also maybe I need a critical friend in school to run things by and to help share initial findings and thoughts so that I know that it's just not coming from me, but it's being measured and tempered by that critical friend in my own setting. Now, the timeline. How am I going to do all of this research? So what possible timeline is there and what's realistic, basically? Okay, so in April, I will review the IDP audit and amend it for use in my school. I'll share the research project with teaching staff. I'll get ethical consent from the head teacher and participants. Then in May, I'll do the initial audit with teaching staff. I'll allow about 2 weeks for completion. Then, following the audit design teaching programme, we'll run over 3 staff meetings. So these meetings will run, again, 3 weeks. June, staff meetings to focus on areas for development, get feedback as we progress to ensure it's meeting the immediate needs. And then in July, finally, the final audit and interviews to triangulate the data, to get data from those different perspectives. And if possible, conduct observations in the classroom to look at strategies. Then analysis and synthesis of findings, suggesting future planning sessions or areas for research that might have come out of the actual data. So again, you can see that that's constructed in a holistic way. It's looked at initially the rationale and the context. It's looked at the aims of the study. It's looked at the literature that adds the context, if you like, the meat around the particular bone of the issue you're going to look at. Methods and implementation, ethical issues, and then a realistic timeline. So again, you can see that this particular study has been uniquely constructed for this particular student's interest, school, context, etc. And yours will be very, very different. But again, hopefully you can see that when you start to look at this in these component bits, actually the project starts to come together as you start to tick off the different components. Now, the most important thing is that on Monday next week, when we meet together, you've had a good attempt at creating, thinking about and discussing this with yourself and getting something written down to share with your colleagues in the research group and also with myself. So hopefully that's where you're at. Hopefully this has been useful. But again, I can't stress it enough. Focus on your own context and think very clearly about what's meaningful to you and your practice. It might be very similar to this. It might be miles away from this particular type of project. But again, it's you that has to drive that based on your own interest and professional context in which you work.